33 years from now, an old Japanese man in a gray suit will stand in a Nebraska barn and weep in front of a rusting machine he once mistook for a weapon of war. But that moment is decades away. Right now, it is September 1945, and the man who will one day weep is 26 years old, sitting in the back of a military transport truck, staring at a landscape so alien it might as well be the surface of the moon. His name is Lieutenant Ishikawa Kenichi of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he is a prisoner of war being driven across the flattest land he has ever seen toward a place called Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, where he will encounter a simple farming machine that will dismantle everything he has ever believed about the world. But before we tell you what happened in Nebraska, you need to understand the man it happened to. Because what makes this story extraordinary is not the machine. Machines are just metal and gasoline. What makes this story extraordinary is the distance between what Ishikawa believed when he arrived and what he understood when he left. That distance, measured not in miles but in shattered certainties, is the real journey of this story. And it begins not in America but in Japan, 8 years earlier inside the walls of the most prestigious military academy in Asia. If you served during those years, or if your father or grandfather did, I would be honored to hear your story in the comments below. And please subscribe because this story has turns that I promise you will not see coming. In 1937, at the age of 18, Ishikawa entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima. The academy sat on an island in the Sato Inland Sea, surrounded by water so calm it reflected the sky like a mirror. It was Japan's Annapolis, the forge where the empire shaped its naval officers, and the training was designed not merely to educate, but to transform. Young men entered Itajima as individuals. They left as instruments of the emperor's will. Cadets rose at 4:30 every morning, 12 months a year. Cold water baths, regardless of season. 4 hours of physical training that pushed young bodies to the edge of collapse. Then classrooms. Navigation, gunnery, torpedo tactics, military engineering, the mathematics of naval warfare. The curriculum was rigorous and thorough. Ishikawa excelled. He graduated third in his class of 112, a distinction that marked him for rapid advancement. But the most important lessons at Etajima were not taught in classrooms. They were taught in assembly halls, in film screenings, in the 1,000 daily rituals that shape belief as relentlessly as water shapes stone. The ideology was called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Yamato, the ancient name for Japan. It held that the Japanese warrior spirit was the supreme force in human conflict. Material advantages, technology, numbers, industrial capacity, all of these were secondary to the purity and ferocity of the Japanese fighting soul. A nation of true warriors could defeat a nation of merchants and factory workers, no matter how many factories they possessed, because spirit was the ultimate weapon, and Japan's spirit was unmatched in human history. This was not presented as opinion. It was presented as fact. Scientific fact, historical fact, spiritual fact. It was reinforced by every teacher, every officer, every textbook, every film, every conversation. There was no alternative framework available, no competing information, no dissenting voice. The system was closed, self-referencing, and absolute. Doubt was not merely discouraged. Doubt was impossible because doubt requires exposure to contradiction, and contradiction had been eliminated from every corner of Ishikawa's world. Before deployment, officers watched specially produced propaganda films about America. Ishikawa remembered one film vividly for the rest of his life. It showed American automobile factories where workers slept on the assembly line. Cars rolling off production lines with doors that did not close and engines that did not start. The narrator's voice was confident and contemptuous. American industry, the narrator declared, was a paper tiger built on propaganda and Hollywood illusion. Their factories produced quantity without quality. Their workers lacked discipline, motivation, and purpose. When faced with the concentrated will of the Japanese warrior, this hollow industrial facade would crumble like wet paper. Ishikawa believed every word, not because he was foolish. He was demonstrably intelligent, one of the finest analytical minds in his graduating class. He believed because belief was the only option the system permitted. Every piece of information he had ever received confirmed the same conclusion. Every authority he had ever trusted taught the same lesson. He was not a victim of personal ignorance. He was a victim of institutional certainty, which is a much more dangerous thing because institutional certainty feels like knowledge. It feels like the solid ground beneath your feet, and you do not discover that the ground is hollow until the moment it gives way beneath you. In February 1944, Ishikawa was serving aboard a destroyer escort in the Truk Lagoon, the massive Japanese naval base in Micronesia that the Imperial Navy called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Truk was supposed to be impregnable. It anchored Japan's defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific home to the combined fleet protected by natural geography and heavy fortifications. On February 17th, the Americans launched Operation Hailstone. Over 2 days, carrier aircraft from 9 American carriers attacked in waves. More than 30 Japanese ships were sunk. 270 aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air. The myth of Truk's invulnerability was shattered in 48 hours of continuous bombardment. Ishikawa's destroyer took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb during the second day. The explosion killed 23 of the 40-man crew instantly. Ishikawa was blown into the water by the blast concussion. His eardrums ruptured, his left arm torn open by shrapnel. He went into the Pacific Ocean trailing blood and clinging to a fragment of wooden decking. He drifted for 3 days. 3 days in the open ocean. No food, no fresh water, except what rain he could catch in his cupped hands. The sun burned his skin raw during the day. The cold sank into his bones at night. Sharks circled, drawn by the blood in the water, but did not attack. Perhaps there was too little of him to interest them, or perhaps the ocean was already full of easier prey from the dozens of sinking ships. During those 3 days, Ishikawa considered what honor demanded. The code of Bushido was clear: death before capture. A true warrior of the emperor would open his veins or simply release the piece of decking and let the Pacific take him. Surrender was not merely shameful. Surrender was a negation of everything a Japanese officer was supposed to be. But Ishikawa did not let go. He never fully understood why. In later years, he would tell himself that weakness and blood loss had robbed him of the capacity for the noble death he was supposed to choose. But deep down, beneath the ideology and the training and the years of conditioning, something more fundamental was operating. The simple, unreasoning animal desire to live. The body's refusal to cooperate with the mind's decision to die. And that desire held on when everything else let go. On the morning of the third day, an American destroyer pulled him from the water. The medics cut away his shredded uniform, cleaned his wounds, set the bones in his arm, started an intravenous drip for dehydration, and placed him on a clean cot in a warm room. They did not beat him. They did not interrogate him. They did not humiliate him. They gave him water and broth and let him sleep. This confused Ishikawa profoundly. He had been taught that Americans tortured prisoners and mutilated the dead. The medical care he received was better than what the Japanese Navy provided its own wounded sailors. But he classified this carefully and deliberately as a tactical deception. The Americans were softening him up. The kindness was a weapon, and he would not be fooled by it. In his breast pocket, soaked with seawater but still legible, was a letter he had written to his mother the night before the battle. In it, he had promised her that he would fight to the death for the emperor, that he would never accept the shame of capture, that she should be proud of a son who chose honor over survival. He kept the letter. He could not bring himself to destroy it because destroying it would mean admitting that the promise was broken. And he could not bear to read it because reading it would force him to confront the distance between the man who wrote those words and the man who now carried them. So the letter stayed in his pocket, folded small water stained, and fading a constant silent accusation. What he would finally do with that letter on a ship leaving Seattle Harbor in April of 1946 would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. But we will come to that. The journey from the Pacific to Nebraska took months. Processing camps in Hawaii, a transport ship to San Francisco, a train across America. The train ride itself was an assault on everything Ishikawa believed. The landscape went on and on and on. Mountains, then desert, then plains stretching to every horizon hour after hour, day after day, and it never ended. Japan is a narrow island nation where mountains are always visible, where the sea is never far, where the landscape is intimate and contained. America was the opposite. It was a continent. The sheer physical size of the country was the first crack in the propaganda because the films at Etajima had shown America as a cramped, overpopulated, decaying place. The reality outside the train window was something else entirely. The war had ended officially on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan signed the Instruments of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Ishikawa and the other prisoners knew this. They had been told. Some, like Ishikawa, accepted the fact with numb resignation. Others refused to believe it. Among those who refused was a man named Sergeant First Class Noda Takeshi, and his refusal would shape the dynamics of the months ahead in ways none of them could predict. The 34 prisoners who arrived at Camp Scotts Bluff in late September 1945 were a cross-section of the Japanese military experience. Among them were men whose stories would intertwine with Ishikawa's in ways none of them could have foreseen. Private Ogawa Haruto was 22, the son of a fisherman from a tiny village in Iwate Prefecture in Japan's remote Tohoku region. Ogawa had no ideology. He had been conscripted in 1943 when Japan began pulling farmers and fishermen into uniform to replace the trained soldiers it was losing at an accelerating rate. He was given 6 weeks of basic training, a rifle older than he was, and shipped to Saipan, where his unit was ordered to participate in a massive banzai charge against fortified American positions. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged that night. Most died within the first hour. Ogawa survived because a piece of shrapnel tore into his leg and knocked him unconscious before the charge began. He woke up in an American field hospital. American surgeons saved his leg a feat that Japanese military medicine, stretched beyond breaking and starved of supplies, almost certainly could not have accomplished under Saipan's conditions. Corporal Fujimoto Ryota was 24, a mechanical engineering student pulled from Tokyo Imperial University in 1943. Of all the prisoners, Fujimoto possessed the technical vocabulary to understand what they would eventually witness at a level the others could not. He was captured at Iwo Jima in March 1945, one of the vanishingly few Japanese soldiers taken alive in a battle where more than 18,000 of 21,000 defenders died. Captain Morimoto Ichiro, at 38, was the oldest and most intellectually formidable member of the group. A former associate professor of political economy at Kyoto University, Morimoto had read Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes before the war. He understood in the abstract language of economics that American industrial capacity was enormous. But there is an abyss between knowing a number and feeling its weight. Morimoto had been captured at Okinawa in June 1945, the war's final and bloodiest land battle. And then there was Noda Takeshi, 32 years old, career military, a true believer in the emperor's divinity and Japan's sacred destiny. Noda had not surrendered. He had been knocked unconscious by a shell blast on Peleliu and woke up in American custody. He knew the war was over. He had been told like everyone else. But knowing and accepting are different things, and Noda chose not to accept. He told himself and anyone who would listen that the surrender announcement was an American fabrication, that the emperor would never capitulate, that the real Japan was still fighting somewhere. He clung to this belief the way Ishikawa had clung to his piece of wooden decking in the Pacific, because without it, he would drown. On the American side of this story, there were men equally shaped by the war, but shaped differently. Sergeant Wallace Brogan was 29, the son of an Irish-American farming family in Iowa. He had volunteered in 1942 only to be kept stateside by a knee he had ruined at 14 falling from a tractor. The Army decided his knee could not withstand combat, so while his younger brother Patrick served as a Marine somewhere in the Pacific, Brogan guarded prisoners in Nebraska. He considered this duty a humiliation. He expected to despise the Japanese prisoners. He expected them to be the savage, subhuman creatures of recruitment posters. What he found were exhausted, bewildered, hungry men who looked nothing like monsters. Harold Engstrom was 48, a second-generation Norwegian-American who had farmed 640 acres of wheat and corn since inheriting the land from his immigrant parents. Harold was a man of few words, broad shoulders and hands calloused since childhood. He had 3 sons. 2 were serving in Europe. The youngest, Thomas, had been 19 when he volunteered for the Marines against Harold's wishes. Thomas was the family's sunshine, the laughing boy, the one who loved baseball and dreamed of agricultural college. He was killed at Guadalcanal in November 1942, when Harold learned he would receive Japanese prisoners as farm labor. His neighbor, Clarence Darby, came to his door. Darby had also lost a son in the Pacific. His face was red with fury. "You're going to let the people who killed your boy eat at your table, work your land." Harold stood in his doorway for a long time. Then he spoke in that slow, measured way of his, the way of a man who never wastes a word. "Wheat doesn't harvest itself, and Thomas wouldn't want me hating strangers instead of farming." Darby left and did not speak to Harold for 6 months. Ruth Engstrom, Harold's wife, was 45, a former elementary school teacher who had watched grief destroy families all around her. She had seen good men turn bitter marriages crumble under the weight of loss, mothers who stopped leaving their houses. She refused to let that happen to her, not out of saintliness, out of a fierce practical determination to deny the war one more victory. It had taken her son. That was enough. It would not take her heart. Earl Kirchner was 63, the third-generation German-American farmer whose grandfather came from Bavaria in 1870. Kirchner spoke English with a thick Midwestern accent and did not know a word of German yet. When the war began, neighbors eyed him sideways because of his surname. That mild experience of being judged by blood rather than character gave him an unexpected empathy for the Japanese prisoners assigned to his farm. And finally, there was Frank Hayashi, 25 years old, the interpreter, a Nisei second-generation Japanese-American born in Sacramento, California. His parents had immigrated from Hiroshima in 1912. His father ran a small grocery store. His mother was a seamstress. In April 1942, Executive Order 9066 gave them 48 hours to dispose of their lives. His father sold the grocery store, the work of 20 years, for a tenth of its value to an opportunistic buyer. They were sent to Tule Lake Relocation Center in Northern California. Tar paper barracks in a windy desert, communal toilets without partitions, dust that invaded everything. From inside that camp, Frank volunteered for the United States Army in 1943. His 2 older brothers volunteered as well. They were assigned to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, the legendary all-Nisei unit that would become the most decorated American military unit for its size and length of service in the entire war. Frank was sent to the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and then to Camp Scotts Bluff, where he became the voice between 2 worlds that regarded each other with suspicion and incomprehension. Frank already knew that Hiroshima had been destroyed. The news had reached him in August, along with the rest of America, because Frank was an American soldier with access to American news, and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima was the biggest story on earth. He knew that the city where his grandparents lived, where his aunts and uncles and cousins carried on the family line, had been obliterated in a single flash of light on August 6th. What he did not yet know was who had survived and who had not. The Red Cross was overwhelmed. Information from Japan was fragmentary and slow. Frank carried this uncertainty like a stone in his chest, serving the nation that may have killed his grandmother, while translating for prisoners who shared his blood, but not his flag. These were the people: the Japanese officer drowning in shame, the fisherman's son who survived a banzai charge by accident, the engineering student from Iwo Jima, the professor who understood economics in theory, but not yet in practice, the fanatic who refused to accept that his world had ended, the American sergeant who expected to hate, the farmer who lost his son but not his decency, the wife who refused to let grief become rage, the old German American who understood prejudice from the receiving end, and the interpreter who belonged to two worlds and fully to neither. They converged on a patch of flat Nebraska farmland in the autumn of 1945, and what happened among them would be shaped by a machine that cut wheat. The first morning on the Engstrom farm began in silence. Harold pulled his Ford pickup to the camp gate at 5:30, the engine idling rough in the cold September air. The sky was still purple along the eastern horizon. Frank Hayashi climbed into the cab. Ishikawa and Fujimoto sat in the open bed, their breath forming small white clouds in the pre-dawn chill. Nobody spoke during the 20-minute drive. The truck bounced along a dirt road that cut through wheat fields so vast they seemed to merge with the sky at every edge. Ishikawa watched the landscape and felt the strangeness of it press against his chest like a weight. In Japan, the horizon was always interrupted by mountains, the view broken into manageable pieces. Here there was nothing. The land ran flat and unbroken to the edge of the earth. He had crossed oceans and survived battles. But this emptiness unsettled him in a way combat never had. Harold parked beside a tool shed at the edge of a field. He got out, opened the shed, and removed two scythes, simple tools, curved blades on long handles, the kind of implement that had been used to harvest grain for thousands of years. Harold demonstrated the cutting motion with a smooth, practiced swing and handed one scythe to Ishikawa, one to Fujimoto. Then he took a third for himself, walked to the edge of the field, and began to work. No speeches, no instructions through the interpreter, no threats or promises. Harold showed them what needed doing and started doing it himself. This was the first quiet shock. The owner of the land performed manual labor alongside his prisoners. In the hierarchy, Ishikawa understood authority meant distance from physical effort. Officers commanded, enlisted men worked, but Harold was the authority here, and he worked harder than anyone, swinging his scythe with a rhythm that spoke of decades of practice. They worked through the morning, the sun climbed, and the wheat fields seemed to go on forever. Ishikawa worked harder than the task required, punishing himself, proving that the Japanese spirit was unbroken, even in captivity. At noon, Harold called them in. He opened a metal cooler from the truck bed and handed each man a sandwich. Thick slices of beef on fresh bread, an apple, a glass bottle of cold milk. Ishikawa stared at the food. The beef alone was more protein than he had received in a week aboard his destroyer during the war's final months, when the Japanese Navy, its supply lines severed by American submarines, had been feeding its crews thin rice gruel and dried fish so old it was more mold than nutrition. Ishikawa told himself the generous food was psychological warfare, a performance designed to weaken Japanese resolve. But then he watched Harold eat. Harold sat on the tailgate of his truck, opened an identical sandwich from the same cooler, poured milk from the same bottle. He ate the same food in the same quantity without ceremony. There was no difference between what the farmer consumed and what the prisoners received. That small observation was the first hairline fracture in the wall. Because if the food was propaganda, Harold was performing it for an audience of no one. The only explanation that made sense was the simplest one. This was not performance. This was just lunch. This was what Harold Engstrom ate every day. At the Kirchner farm 20 miles away, Ogawa was undergoing his own quiet education. Earl Kirchner, 63 and aching in every joint, did not have the energy for pretense. He needed help. Ogawa was young and strong. Within the first week, Kirchner began teaching Ogawa to operate his tractor, a John Deere Model B, manufactured in 1938. Ogawa, the fisherman's son, took to the machine immediately. He understood engines. An engine was an engine whether it pushed a boat through water or pulled a plow through soil. Kirchner saw this mechanical intelligence and began to trust him. One afternoon, Kirchner sat on the porch reading a letter from his eldest son serving in France. He read a passage aloud through the interpreter. His son had written about encountering German prisoners and being surprised by how ordinary they looked. "They look just like us, Pop," the letter said. Kirchner looked at Ogawa and said, "I bet my boy would say the same thing if he met you over there." Ogawa said nothing, but he remembered that sentence for the rest of his life. Back at the camp in the evenings, Ishikawa found himself drawn to the small store inside the administration building. The camp store stocked soap, toothpaste, cigarettes, candy writing paper, and reading material. Prisoners earned modest wages in camp scrip and could spend freely. American cigarettes lined the shelves. Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, multiple brands, abundant supply available to the lowest-ranking prisoner for a few hours' wages. In the Japanese military, cigarettes had been luxury items strictly rationed, often available only to officers. But the reading material unsettled him more than the cigarettes. Among the offerings were actual American newspapers, not propaganda sheets prepared for prisoners, but real newspapers with editorials that criticized the American government, debated military strategy, and argued about post-war policy. Colonel Caldwell, the camp commander, had authorized these materials, deliberately believing that exposing prisoners to the messy reality of American democracy was more powerful than any curated message. Over the following days, Fujimoto translated sections for Ishikawa. One editorial attacked the government's rationing policies. Another questioned whether the atomic bombing had been morally justified. A letter to the editor demanded better treatment for Japanese prisoners. The next letter demanded worse. In the Empire of Japan, publishing criticism of military policy meant immediate arrest. Here, citizens disagreed with their government in print daily, and nothing happened to them. The government did not collapse. Society continued to function. Indeed, it functioned well enough to win a global war, while its citizens freely and loudly argued about everything. The equation did not balance. Something in Ishikawa's understanding was fundamentally wrong, and he could feel the wrongness like a loose tooth. Meanwhile, Noda Takeshi was maintaining a shadow authority in the barracks after dark. He enforced military protocol among the prisoners. Salutes for officers, reverence when the emperor's name was spoken, surveillance of anyone who showed signs of softening. One night, about 2 weeks after arrival, Noda called a meeting after lights out. He spoke in a fierce whisper. "What they tell us about the surrender is propaganda. Everything you see, the food, the farms, is a performance staged to break your will. The emperor would never capitulate. The real Japan is still fighting. Any man who cooperates with the Americans will answer for it when we go home." Ishikawa listened from his bunk. Part of him wanted to believe Noda because it would have been easier, simpler to maintain the old certainties. But another part of him, the part that had watched Harold eat the same sandwich that had noticed the newspapers with their open disagreements, whispered a dangerous thought. What if Noda is wrong about this too? He said nothing. Not yet. He was still gathering evidence. And then came the conversation that cracked the wall odder than anything else had. One evening in early October, Ishikawa found himself alone with Frank Hayashi outside the barracks. Not an official interaction. No guards watching. Just two men who shared a language and in some biological sense a heritage, standing in the Nebraska dark while the wind moved across the plains. Ishikawa had been taught that men like Frank were traitors to their blood. Japanese by genetics, American by allegiance. But curiosity drove him to ask, why do you serve them? They are not your people. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he told Ishikawa about Tule Lake, about Executive Order 9066, about his father selling the grocery store for pennies, about the tar paper barracks and the communal toilets and the desert dust that coated everything. Ishikawa listened with growing disbelief. America imprisons its own citizens. Frank nodded, and then he said something that struck Ishikawa with the force of a physical blow. Yes, and I still volunteered to fight for this country. My two brothers are with the 442nd in Europe fighting Germans, while our parents sit behind barbed wire in California. Because a nation that can make terrible mistakes and still have the ability to recognize those mistakes, to argue about them openly, to let its citizens say this is wrong without being executed, that nation is worth defending. The Empire of Japan never allowed that, never allowed doubt, never allowed anyone to say the generals are wrong, the strategy is wrong. And that is why the empire is gone. Ishikawa had no answer. The concept was too large, too foreign. A nation that imprisoned its own people could still be worth defending. A system that permitted open criticism was stronger than one that demanded silence. He went to his bunk and lay awake for hours. Outside, the Nebraska wind ran across the flatlands without obstruction, and Ishikawa thought about how that wind moved freely because there were no barriers to stop it. In Japan, mountains broke the wind into contained pockets. Here it simply went wherever it chose. Perhaps ideas work the same way. Where barriers existed, they stagnated. Where barriers were removed, they collided and evolved. Perhaps the arguing and disagreeing that seemed so chaotic was not weakness at all. Perhaps it was the mechanism by which a society corrected its own errors. These were dangerous thoughts. Ishikawa did not yet trust them, but the cracks were widening and through them, light was beginning to enter. Then came the Thursday morning in early October that blew the entire wall down. Harold Engstrom drove up to the field where Ishikawa and Fujimoto had been cutting wheat for 3 weeks. Behind his pickup came a flatbed truck carrying something enormous draped in heavy canvas. The prisoner stopped working and watched as Harold parked and walked to the flatbed. 2 farmhands untied ropes and pulled the canvas free. Ishikawa saw a machine unlike anything he had encountered outside of a naval shipyard. It was a Massey Harris Model 21 self-propelled combine harvester built in 1941. Nearly 20 feet from front to back, 8 feet tall at the grain storage bin. Across the front, a cutting header stretched 12 feet wide, bristling with serrated blades. Behind the header, a bewildering complex of drum screens, conveyor belts, fans, and elevators, all connected by drive belts and gear systems. The body was painted red, though 4 years of use had faded the paint to reveal raw steel beneath. Ishikawa's first reaction was tactical. His mind assessed the machine the way Etajima had trained him to assess enemy vessels. Size, mass, complexity, threat. His conclusion was immediate and completely wrong. This was a weapon, some kind of armored vehicle or mobile artillery platform disguised as civilian equipment. The sheer scale of it, the engineering complexity, the amount of steel required, this could not possibly be farm equipment. He leaned toward Fujimoto and whispered, "They are showing us a weapon." Fujimoto was already examining the machine with different eyes. The engineering students saw cutting surfaces designed for plant material, separation systems calibrated for grain and chaff, a collection apparatus built to handle loose kernels, no gun mounts, no armor plating, no ammunition storage. "This is not a weapon," Fujimoto said, and his voice held something close to awe. "This is a farming machine." Through Frank's translation, Harold began to explain. He opened panels, pointed to mechanisms, traced the path of wheat through the system with a grease-blackened finger. The header cut the stalks as the machine moved forward. A threshing drum spun at high speed, beating grain kernels loose from the seed heads. Screens and fans separated grain from chaff. Clean grain traveled up an elevator into the storage bin. Everything happened simultaneously, continuously, while the machine rolled forward on its own power. A single combine, Harold said, could harvest about 30 acres in a good day. Fujimoto translated. His voice had gone quiet. He did the mathematics in his head. A strong worker with a hand scythe could manage about half an acre per day. This machine equaled 60 men. One machine. 60 workers. And Harold said there were tens of thousands of machines like this one across the country. Then Harold said the thing that detonated inside every prisoner's mind. This one is a 41 model, 4 years old now. These are standard on farms and all across America. Have been since the 30s. This is not new. This is just how we farm. Harold started the engine. The sound was enormous, a deep mechanical roar that vibrated through the ground and into the bones of every man standing there. Several prisoners stepped back involuntarily. Harold engaged the drive systems. The header blades began to spin. The threshing drum hummed to life. The fans started, and the combine began to move. It rolled forward into the standing wheat at walking pace, and the effect was mesmerizing. The 12-foot header swept into golden stalks, and they vanished. One moment, a wall of wheat dense and upright. The next moment, gone. Inside the machine, the threshing drum worked with rapid mechanical beating. At the rear, chopped straw and chaff sprayed onto the cleared ground. At the top, clean grain poured into the storage bin in a steady stream like liquid gold. In 15 minutes, the combine harvested an area that would have taken all 34 prisoners an entire day to accomplish with hand tools. The prisoners stood in absolute silence. And then the second realization hit. The Americans had been giving them scythes not because combines were unavailable, not because the prisoners' labor was essential, but because there were not enough combines to harvest everything at once. The prisoners were filling in the gaps, supplementary, incidental. The machine was the real workforce. Everything they had accomplished in 3 weeks of back-breaking labor could have been done by one man and one machine in an afternoon. Harold added one more detail in the casual tone of a man discussing weather. During the war, the factories that build these machines switched over to producing tanks and planes. Now the fighting is done, they're switching back. Same factories, same workers, same assembly lines. Tanks 1 year combines the next. Tanks 1 year combines the next. The same industrial base that produced the weapons that sank the Imperial Japanese Navy also produced machines that fed a continent, and it switched between the two as easily as a farmer changes boots. That evening in the barracks, 4 men gathered and spoke in voices barely above whispers. Ishikawa, Fujimoto, Morimoto, Ogawa. Captain Morimoto, the professor of political economy, spoke first. He had spent weeks observing, reserving judgment. Now the data was in. If an ordinary farmer owns that machine, and there are tens of thousands more across the country, and the same factories that build them also build tanks and aircraft, then the industrial capacity of the United States exists in a dimension our leadership could not conceive. The assessments we were given, the intelligence estimates, were not mistakes. They were fantasies. We did not lose because we lacked courage. We lost because our leaders sent us to fight a civilization whose productive power they could not even imagine. Ishikawa took out the small notebook the guards allowed him to keep. He began writing everything: the specifications of the combine, the 30 acres per day, Harold's mention of factory conversion, the truck that carried the combine, the fuel that powered it. Each detail was a thread, and together they wove a picture of a nation so systematically productive that opposing it by force was not courage. It was a form of blindness that killed the people it claimed to serve. From that night, the prisoners began to see Nebraska with entirely new eyes. Ogawa at the Kirchner farm watched the old farmer order a replacement gear for his tractor from a Sears catalog. The part arrived 3 days later, shipped from a warehouse in Minneapolis, 600 miles away. Factory new. Kirchner installed it in 40 minutes. Ogawa understood logistics at a gut level. He had watched soldiers on Saipan starve because rice could not reach them. He had seen men die for lack of ammunition while supply ships were sunk by American submarines. And here a civilian farmer in the middle of nowhere received a tractor part by mail in 3 days. He said to Fujimoto that evening, "Their civilian supply system works better than our military supply system ever did. They deliver tractor parts to farmers faster than we delivered rice to soldiers. We never stood a chance." Fujimoto cataloged the infrastructure surrounding the Engstrom farm. Electrical power lines connected to every farmstead in sight, no matter how small. He learned that the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 had brought electricity to the majority of American farms within a decade. In Japan, many rural villages still had no power in 1940. Here, even a temporary prisoner of war camp had reliable electricity, running water, and scheduled fuel delivery. Ishikawa noticed the wristwatches. Every American guard wore one, but no two were the same. Different brands, different styles, different price points. The diversity implied mass production of even small consumer goods on a scale Japan had never achieved. If America could produce enough personal wristwatches for every enlisted soldier to buy one with his own money as a personal accessory rather than military equipment, then the question was not whether American industry was powerful. The question was whether there was any limit to its power at all. Morimoto synthesized all of these observations into a framework he shared with the others one evening. The Americans have built what I can only call a civilization of systems. No single element is extraordinary. The roads are adequate, the electricity is reliable, the mail is consistent, but each system supports every other system, creating a whole incomparably greater than any single part. This is the real source of their power. Not genius, not racial superiority, integration. Thousands of ordinary achievements connected into a functioning whole. But not everyone was looking with new eyes. Noda discovered Ishikawa's notebook. He found it during a self-appointed barracks inspection, rifled through Ishikawa's belongings, and read the detailed observations, the technical notes, the questions about American society. That night, Noda confronted Ishikawa in front of the entire barracks. He stood in the center aisle between the bunks holding the notebook, his voice carrying the tone of a military tribunal. Lieutenant Ishikawa, you have been writing reports praising the enemy, words that betray the emperor. When we return to Japan, you will answer for this. The barracks went silent. Every man was watching. Noda represented the old order, certainty, hierarchy, the system that demanded belief and punished doubt. Ishikawa stood. His heart was beating hard, but his voice was steady. This notebook is not a report for the Americans. It is a report for me. I am trying to understand why we lost. Can you explain it, Sergeant Noda? Can you tell me why an American farmer owns a machine that replaces 60 men while our soldiers on Saipan starved because rice could not reach them? If loving Japan means closing our eyes to these facts, then it was exactly that blindness that killed our comrades. Not the Americans. Us. Our certainty, our refusal to see. Silence. Noda stared at Ishikawa. His jaw worked, but no words came. Because the facts Ishikawa stated were not opinions. They were observations, concrete and unanswerable. Noda could invoke the emperor's name and the code of Bushido, but he could not make the combine harvester disappear. Noda turned and walked to his bunk without another word. From that night, his authority began to erode, not because Ishikawa was necessarily right about everything, but because for the first time someone had said aloud what many had been thinking in silence. November deepened. The corn harvest brought another machine, a mechanical corn picker, that moved through standing rows and stripped husked and collected ears of corn in a single continuous operation. Fujimoto examined it with professional fascination. The engineering required to grip an ear of corn, twist it from a stalk, and remove the layered husk mechanically was in some ways more impressive than the combine because it required the machine to replicate the specific motions of a human hand. This was not brute force engineering. This was finesse. And it confirmed something Fujimoto had been suspecting. American agricultural technology was not a collection of isolated inventions. It was the product of an ongoing conversation between engineers and farmers. Each improvement building on the last, each design responding to feedback from the people who actually use the machines. In Japan's hierarchical system, instructions flowed downward. Feedback from below was structurally impossible. Here, a farmer could write to a manufacturer and say this part breaks too often, and the manufacturer would redesign it. Information moved in every direction, and the result was machines that actually worked for the people who needed them. One Sunday, Kirshner invited Ogawa to sit on the porch while Kirshner listened to a baseball game on the radio. Through the interpreter, Kirshner tried to explain the rules. Ogawa did not understand the sport, but he understood the ritual. An old man on his porch listening to a game, drinking coffee, watching the sun move across his fields. This was peace. This was what life without war looked like. Ogawa's father had done something similar back in Iwate. After a day on the boats, he would sit on the wooden veranda of their small house drinking tea, watching fishing boats return to harbor as the sun set. Different continent, different drink, different view, same peace. Then Harold Engstrom did something that would produce the most emotionally devastating moment of Ishikawa's entire time in Nebraska. On a cold day in mid-November, he invited Ishikawa and Fujimoto inside his home for lunch. It was not a grand gesture. Harold simply said through Frank that it was too cold to eat outside and they might as well come in. But for Ishikawa, crossing the threshold of an American farmhouse was like entering another dimension. The house was not large or luxurious. 2 stories, white clapboard, practical and clean. But it contained things Ishikawa cataloged with the same precision he had applied to the combine harvester. An electric refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a radio playing music on a shelf, a telephone mounted on the wall, and on a side table in the parlor, framed photographs that Ishikawa's eyes found and could not leave. Harold and Ruth on their wedding day. 3 boys at various ages, the tallest holding a baseball glove, and a young man in a Marine uniform cap, tilted slightly, smiling a smile so open and unguarded it hurt to look at. That was Thomas. Ruth Engstrom served beef sandwiches on bread she had baked that morning, vegetables from the root cellar, cold milk, and a slice of apple pie with a lattice crust, golden brown, and precisely crimped, the kind of pie that takes years of practice to make well, and that Ruth had been making since she was 12 years old. What struck Ishikawa was not the abundance, it was the casualness. Ruth served this meal with the efficiency of a woman performing a routine she had performed thousands of times. This was not a special occasion. This was an ordinary weekday. This was simply what Americans ate while their sons lay in military cemeteries on Pacific Islands 8,000 miles away. Through Frank, Ruth asked a question that opened a door neither side was prepared for. What do your families eat at home in Japan? Ishikawa described his childhood meals: rice, grilled fish, pickled vegetables, miso soup. Simple but sufficient. Then, without planning to, he found himself describing meals aboard his destroyer in the war's final months. Rice gruel so thin he could see the bottom of the bowl. Dried fish covered in mold. Vitamin deficiencies that made gums bleed and eyes blur. The Imperial Japanese Navy unable to feed the men who served on its ships. The comparison hung in the air unspoken, but understood by everyone at the table. Then Harold told them about Thomas. He spoke slowly, even more carefully than usual, as if each word were a seed being examined before planting. Thomas loved baseball. Thomas played shortstop and had a throwing arm the coach called the best in 20 years. Thomas wanted to study agricultural science, talked about soil chemistry at the dinner table with a passion that lit up his face. Thomas enlisted the day after his 18th birthday because his friends were enlisting and he could not stand to be left behind. Thomas wrote letters home from boot camp. Large, messy handwriting, creative spelling. He complained that the food was not as good as his mother's. He asked about the farm, the wheat, whether his dog still waited for him on the porch. He signed every letter the same way. Your boy Thomas. Harold stopped talking. He did not cry. He simply stopped the way a machine stops when something essential inside it fails. His hands lay flat on the table and his eyes were fixed on a point beyond the wall, beyond Nebraska, beyond the physical world. Ruth continued where Harold could not. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was controlled with the iron discipline of 3 years of daily practice. I do not hate Japanese people. I hate the war. The war takes the children of every mother, American mothers, Japanese mothers. It does not care whose child it kills. It does not read the letters they wrote home. She paused. Her hands were folded in her lap, gripping each other hard enough to whiten the knuckles. The war took my son. That is enough. It will not take my decency. It will not turn me into someone Thomas would not recognize. Ishikawa sat motionless. In the imperial military, Ruth's words would have been considered treasonous. Grief that transcended nationality, compassion for the enemy, refusal to hate. These were ideologically forbidden because the entire structure of wartime society depended on dehumanizing the other side. And yet here was Ruth Engstrom, whose son had been killed by men in the same uniform Ishikawa wore, feeding him pie and speaking of peace in her kitchen, while Thomas smiled from a photograph in the next room. For the first time in his life, Ishikawa felt a shame that had nothing to do with military failure. He was ashamed of his education, shame that he had spent 26 years being taught that people like Ruth were subhuman, inferior, morally bankrupt. And she was offering him food and grace in the same room where her dead son's photograph watched from the shelf. He bowed his head, not the quick bow of protocol. The deep, slow, deliberate bow reserved for moments of profound respect, held for a long time, his forehead nearly touching the table. When he straightened, Ruth was looking at him with an expression that needed no translation. She understood. I want to pause here for a moment. If this story has moved you, if Ruth's words or Ishikawa's transformation has touched something in your own experience, I hope you will share your thoughts in the comments. And if you have not yet, please subscribe. The final part of this story contains moments that I believe will stay with you for a very long time. Winter descended on Nebraska with brutal force. Temperatures plunged below zero and stayed there for weeks. Wind drove snow horizontally across the plains, piling drifts against the barracks walls. Most of the prisoners had never experienced cold like this. But the barracks were heated. Coal stoves maintained tolerable warmth. The Americans provided heavy coats, wool hats, gloves, insulated boots. The food continued unchanged. Medical care was available for frostbite and the respiratory ailments that came with the cold. Ishikawa wrote in his notebook a sentence that crystallized months of observation. We are prisoners in the harshest winter I have ever known, and we are better fed, better housed, and better clothed than I was as a serving officer aboard an Imperial Navy warship. If this is how Americans treat their enemies, what does that tell us about the nation we were taught to despise? During the winter months, prisoners requested English lessons. Frank Hayashi taught 3 evenings a week. Others requested magazines. Brogan brought copies of Life and the Saturday Evening Post. The prisoners studied advertisements as intensely as articles. A Chevrolet sedan, a Frigidaire refrigerator, consumer goods produced and marketed during wartime. Morimoto noted that if American industry maintained enough excess capacity to produce competing brands of refrigerators while simultaneously fighting a global war on 2 fronts, then its total productive potential was beyond any calculation Japanese planners had ever made. Then in January 1946, the full weight of the war's ending arrived. The prisoners had known since September that Japan as a Romero had surrendered, but knowing it as an abstract fact and confronting its full reality were different things. In January camp, authorities provided detailed briefings, newspapers, photographs, accounts of the destruction, the atomic bombs, Hiroshima, a single device carried by a single aircraft destroying an entire city, 70,000 dead instantly, tens of thousands more in the weeks that followed. Nagasaki 3 days later, another city erased. The emperor's radio address. Hirohito speaking to his subjects for the first time in history, telling them they must endure the unendurable. The occupation. MacArthur in Tokyo. The dismantling of the Japanese military. The beginning of a transformation so complete that the nation emerging on the other side would be unrecognizable. Reactions were raw and varied. Some men wept. Some knelt facing east and prayed. Some sat still as stone processing grief too large for expression. Noda went to the latrine and did not emerge for hours. When he came out, the rigid certainty that had defined his face was gone, replaced by something empty. Morimoto spoke into the silence. The question is no longer why we lost. The question is how we rebuild. And then Frank Hayashi received the letter he had been dreading. A Red Cross communication, months delayed, confirmed the specific fate of his family in Hiroshima. His grandmother was dead. His uncle was dead. Two cousins were dead. His aunt was in a hospital with burns covering 40% of her body. She would die within weeks. Frank had known since August that Hiroshima was destroyed, but knowing the city was gone and knowing that his grandmother's body lay somewhere in its ashes were different kinds of knowledge. The first was information. The second was grief. That evening, Ishikawa found Frank sitting alone outside the barracks. The temperature was well below freezing. Frank's coat was unbuttoned. His hands were bare. His face was buried in his palms, and his shoulders shook. Ishikawa, the man who had once called men like Frank traitors to their blood, sat down beside him. He said nothing. There were no words in any language for this particular geometry of loss. Frank mourned as an American whose country had won the war, and as a man of Japanese blood whose family had been consumed by the weapon that won it. He mourned as a son whose parents were behind barbed wire and a grandson whose grandmother was ashes. And Ishikawa sat beside him in the Nebraska darkness and shared the silence because silence was the most honest thing he could offer. They sat together the way soldiers share a foxhole, two men caught in the same storm, each drenched in a different kind of rain. It was the truest communication either man had ever experienced. Spring came slowly to Nebraska in 1946. Snow melted in stages retreating across the plains, revealing brown earth that gradually greened. Repatriation schedules were announced. Transport ships would depart Seattle in late April. The news brought anxiety as much as relief. The prisoners were going home, but to what? Their cities bombed. Their economy collapsed. The emperor humbled. Japan occupied by the forces they had fought. Many feared what awaited them. In Japanese culture, returned prisoners of war carried a stigma worse than wounds. They were men who should have died and did not. Society did not know what to do with them. In the final weeks, the rigid hierarchies of the barracks dissolved. The Imperial Navy no longer existed. The Army no longer existed. There were no more ranks, no more protocol. Just men preparing to become civilians in a country that would demand they become something they had never been trained to be. Noda maintained his military bearing to the last day. Uniform pressed, posture rigid, but the energy had drained from his rigidity. He no longer tried to enforce discipline. He had become a monument to an idea that no one believed in anymore. Ishikawa watched him and felt something unexpected. Compassion. Not for Noda's ideology, which had been wrong and destructive. Compassion for the man trapped inside it. A man so completely defined by a system that when the system died, the man did not know how to continue living. On Ogawa's last day at the Kirchner farm, the old farmer and the young fisherman sat on the porch one final time. Through the interpreter, Kirchner shared the philosophy that 50 years of working the land had distilled in him. The soil does not care who you are. Rain falls on American fields, and Japanese fields the same. You plant, you tend, you harvest. You cannot bully the earth into giving more than it has. You can only use better tools and better methods. That is the whole secret of this country. Not magic, not superior blood, good tools and willingness to learn. Ogawa listened with the total attention of a man receiving instructions he intended to follow for the rest of his life. A guard named Jimmy McAllister, a private from Oklahoma, gave Ogawa a small folding pocket knife as a farewell gift. It was worth almost nothing in monetary terms. Ogawa kept it for the rest of his life. Before departure, Brogan arranged a final visit for Ishikawa to the Engstrom farm. He drove Ishikawa out on a Saturday morning in April, with Frank translating for the last time. Harold was in the machine shed servicing the combine harvester for the coming season. The Massey Harris had been stripped of its winter covering, cleaned, oiled, inspected. Harold was replacing a drive belt, his hands black with grease, his movements precise and economical. Ishikawa stood in the doorway and watched. 6 months ago, he had believed this machine was a weapon. He had looked at it through eyes trained to see threat everywhere. Now he saw it for what it was: a tool, built by engineers who wanted to make a farmer's work easier, designed to cut wheat, doing exactly what it was made to do. Through Frank, Ishikawa thanked Harold. He said the experience had been educational in ways he suspected he would be processing for the rest of his life. Then he asked the question that had been forming for weeks. When I go back to Japan, what should I tell people about America? Harold stopped working. He straightened, slowly wiped his hands on a rag, and took a long time to answer. Because Harold Engstrom never said anything he had not thought about first. Tell them Americans are not superhuman. We are lazy and scared and greedy like anyone else. But we build systems. Schools, roads, factories, supply chains. We build them so that even when individual people are imperfect, the whole thing keeps running. He pointed at the combine. That machine was not invented by one genius. It is the result of thousands of small improvements over many generations by ordinary people who wanted to do their work a little better each year. Japan can do the same thing. You do not need to copy America. You need to build your own systems based on what is true instead of what you wish were true. He paused, then said the words Ishikawa would carry for the rest of his life. That machine is not a weapon, but it is more powerful than any weapon because weapons destroy and this feeds people. A nation that feeds its people is a nation that cannot be defeated. Build things that feed people and no one can take that from you. Ishikawa bowed, the deep, formal, reverent bow. Harold extended his hand. Ishikawa looked at it. This calloused, grease-blackened hand of a Nebraska wheat farmer. The hand of a man who had lost his youngest son to a war, fought against Ishikawa's nation, and had responded not with hatred, but with work and quiet, stubborn decency. Ishikawa took the hand. It was the first time in his life he had shaken hands with a foreigner. The grip was firm and warm, the palm rough with decades of labor. A farmer's hand, not so different from his own father's hand back in Nagoya. They stood that way for a moment, connected across everything that should have divided them in a machine shed beside a combine harvester that had once been mistaken for a weapon of war and had turned out to be something far more powerful. Seattle, late April 1946. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners filing through checkpoints on the docks, receiving documents and supply packages for the voyage home. Ishikawa stood on the deck of the transport ship as it pulled away from the pier. The Seattle skyline receded. America grew smaller. Nebraska was already 1,000 miles behind him, already becoming memory. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the letter. The letter to his mother, written before Truk nearly 2 years ago. The promise to fight to the death. The declaration that surrender was worse than death. The paper was soft, now worn thin. Along the fold lines, the ink faded. He read it one last time. The handwriting was his. The words were his. But they belonged to a man who no longer existed. A man who had never seen a combine harvester work a wheat field, who had never eaten apple pie in the home of a farmer whose son his nation had killed, who had never sat in silence beside a Japanese-American soldier mourning a grandmother destroyed by an American bomb, who had never shaken the calloused hand of a man who chose decency over hatred. Ishikawa tore the letter into small pieces. He held them in his open palm and watched the wind tug at the fragments. White scraps against the gray Pacific, each one carrying a word from a promise that had turned out to be a measure not of his honor, but of his ignorance. He opened his hand. The pieces scattered across the water, spinning and tumbling in the ship's wake, growing smaller, disappearing, gone. The man who wrote that letter was dead. The man on the deck did not yet know who he would become, but he knew who he was not, and that was enough to start. On the dock below, Frank Hayashi watched the ship leave. He did not board. He was American, despite the camp, despite Hiroshima, despite everything. He raised his hand and held it there. He thought of the night he and Ishikawa had sat together in the Nebraska darkness, sharing silence and grief, two men from opposite sides of a war finding in each other's quiet company the only honest response to a world that had wounded them both. Someone on the ship waved back. Frank could not tell who. It did not matter. The years that followed scattered these men across the world like seeds carried on the wind. And like seeds, they grew in ways no one could have predicted. Ogawa returned to his fishing village in Iwate to find it largely destroyed. He worked as a day laborer hauling rubble, sleeping in a shelter of salvaged wood. But he had a plan. Within 3 years, he saved enough to buy a small motorized fishing boat. While other fishermen still rowed wooden vessels, Ogawa fitted his with an engine and went farther, faster, caught more. He applied the principle he had learned watching Kirchner and the tractor. Mechanization was not laziness, it was multiplication. One man with the right tool could outperform 10 without. His operation became one of the most productive in the region. He advocated for modernizing fishing practices across Iwate, traveling to other coastal villages to demonstrate what motorized boats could do. By the early 1960s, Iwate had one of the most modern fishing fleets in Japan. In 1962, Ogawa took his teenage son to an agricultural exposition in Tokyo. A Japanese manufactured combine harvester was on display. Ogawa stood before it for a long time, hands in his pockets. Then he turned to his son. Machines like this once seemed impossible to me. I saw one for the first time as a prisoner in America, and I could not believe it existed. The greatest lesson of my life was that understanding requires humility. Ignorance combined with certainty is the most dangerous combination in the world. Never be certain, son. Always be willing to discover that you are wrong. Morimoto returned to Kyoto University and built a distinguished career in economics. He wrote about industrial policy and the relationship between technology, productivity, and social organization, drawing constantly on his experience as a prisoner. He influenced a generation of economists who helped design the policies driving Japan's post-war economic miracle. He told his students the same lesson year after year. I was a professor of political economy. I could quote American production statistics from memory. I knew in the abstract that America was powerful. And yet, when I saw a combine harvester in a Nebraska wheat field, I was as shocked as the fisherman standing beside me who had never read a book about economics. Because knowing about a thing and understanding a thing are separated by an abyss that no reading can cross. You must see. You must stand in the presence of the thing itself. Noto returned to a Japan that had no use for him. He spent years adrift, drinking, menial jobs, estranged from family who wanted to move forward while he stayed anchored to a past that existed only in his memory. He was not evil. He had never been evil. He was a man so thoroughly shaped by a system that when the system was destroyed, the man inside could not find a shape of his own. Slowly over years, reality wore him down. In the early 1950s, he found work at a factory that manufactured agricultural machinery. The irony was complete. The man who had refused to accept the significance of the American combine harvester now earned his living building Japanese ones. He rarely spoke of the war. When he did, it was with the quiet sadness of a man who understood too late that the thing he fought hardest to protect had been the thing most deserving of destruction. Brogan left the Army and became a high school history teacher in Des Moines, Iowa. He corresponded with former prisoners for years. Letters crossing the Pacific in both directions, discussing their experiences with a directness that would have been impossible during the war. In one letter, Brogan wrote, "I arrived at that camp convinced Japanese soldiers were monsters. I left knowing they were men. Some good, some bad, most in the middle. Exactly like us." Frank Hayashi returned to Sacramento after his family was released from Tule Lake. Using the GI Bill, he studied law and became one of the first Japanese-American attorneys in California. He spent decades fighting for civil rights. In 1988, at the age of 68, he stood in the audience as President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, officially apologizing for the internment of Japanese Americans. Frank's elderly mother received a government check for $20,000 in reparations. Frank donated his own payment to a scholarship fund. Harold and Ruth Engstrom continued farming until Harold's death in 1972 and Ruth's in 1975. They rarely spoke publicly about the prisoners. But Clarence Darby, the neighbor who had confronted Harold about accepting enemy labor, eventually came around. Years later, Darby told a friend, "You cannot harvest wheat with anger. You can only harvest it with tools and willing hands." Harold understood that from the start. Took me longer. In Ishikawa. Ishikawa returned to a Japan that did not know what to do with him. He was investigated by occupation authorities and cleared. He was avoided by former classmates who could not forgive his survival, but his mother welcomed him home, and that was enough. His English learned from newspapers and Frank Hayashi's evening lessons in a Nebraska prison camp became his salvation. He found work as a translator for the occupation forces, bridging the cultural gap between American administrators and Japanese civilians. He explained American intentions to suspicious Japanese communities. He explained Japanese concerns to bewildered American officers. He stood in the space between two worlds and made each one visible to the other. The same work Frank Hayashi had done carried forward. He married in 1949. A woman named Yoshiko, an elementary school teacher he met during a public education campaign. They had 3 children. He named his eldest son Takeshi after Noda because Ishikawa understood that Noda had not been his enemy. Noda had been a fellow prisoner of the same lies, a man who lacked the fortune to find his way out. Ishikawa never became famous or wealthy. He lived quietly. He raised his children with a single lesson repeated in different forms throughout their lives. Never believe you know everything. The moment you are certain you understand the world, you have stopped seeing it. That is the most dangerous mistake a human being can make. In 1978, Ishikawa Kenichi returned to Nebraska. He was 59 years old, silver-haired, gray business suit. He had come as part of a Japanese trade delegation examining American agricultural technology because by 1978, Japan was the world's second-largest economy, and Japanese companies were producing agricultural machinery that competed with American brands on the global market. The devastated nation he had returned to in 1946 had accomplished exactly what Harold Engstrom said it could. It had built its own systems based on truth, and those systems had produced prosperity beyond anything imaginable in that wheat field in 1945. The delegation's itinerary did not include Scotts Bluff, but Ishikawa rented a car and drove 6 hours across the plains through landscape he recognized even after 33 years. The flatness, the vastness, the sky so large it made you feel like a speck. Wheat fields, golden in the autumn sun, and combine harvesters. Working those fields, enormous modern machines 3 times the size of Harold's old Massey Harris, with air-conditioned cabs and technology Harold could not have dreamed of. Thousands of small improvements over many generations by ordinary people. The Engstrom farm was still in operation, run by Daniel Engstrom, Harold's grandson, born after the war. Daniel had grown up on stories about the Japanese prisoners who worked Grandpa's farm. He had never understood why Harold kept the old combine harvester, a machine decades obsolete, in the barn rather than selling it for scrap. Daniel led Ishikawa into the barn. In the corner, under a canvas tarp thick with dust, stood the Massey Harris Model 21. The red paint had faded to dull brown. The rubber belts had cracked. The header blades were spotted with corrosion. But the machine was intact, preserved by Harold's quiet decision to keep it, a decision whose meaning Harold may never have fully articulated, but that Ishikawa now understood perfectly. Ishikawa stood before the machine. 33 years. He had been 26 the first time he saw it, standing in a wheat field on a Thursday morning, absolutely certain it was a weapon of war. He had looked at this machine and seen threat because threat was the only thing his education had prepared him to see. He had been unable to imagine that engineering this complex could be devoted to anything other than destruction, because destruction was the only purpose his world had taught him to recognize. He reached out and touched the cold metal. His fingers traced the rivets, the seam where two panels met the manufacturer's plate with its faded lettering. The engine that had once roared loud enough to shake the ground was silent forever. The threshing drum was frozen in place. The grain elevator was empty and would remain empty, but the machine was here. Harold had kept it, and Ishikawa understood why. It was testimony. This machine had witnessed a moment when ideology met reality and reality won. It had stood in a field and simply been itself a tool built for feeding rather than destroying. And in being itself, it had accomplished what no argument or punishment could accomplish. It had shown the truth, and the truth does not require belief. It simply is. Ishikawa wept, not from sadness, from gratitude, for this machine, for Harold who was gone, for Ruth who was gone, for Frank Hayashi somewhere in California, building a more just world one case at a time, for Kirshner and Brogan and the guard from Oklahoma who gave Ogawa a pocket knife, for Americans who had responded to ignorance not with cruelty, but with the most devastating weapon in any civilization's arsenal. The simple, patient, overwhelming demonstration of how things actually are. From his briefcase, Ishikawa took an envelope. Inside was a drawing he had made from memory in 1946, shortly after returning to Japan. The combine harvester as he had first seen it. The drawing was crude, technically inaccurate, the proportions wrong. But it captured something a photograph could not. It captured the machine as seen through the eyes of a man whose entire world was being dismantled. It captured awe and terror and the first faint glimmer of understanding that the world was larger and more generous than anything he had been permitted to imagine. He gave the drawing to Daniel Engstrom. Daniel hung it on the barn wall next to a framed photograph of his Uncle Thomas, the 19-year-old Marine who never came home from Guadalcanal. A Japanese officer's drawing of an American machine beside an American boy's portrait in a Nebraska barn. The war's wreckage and the pieces' gifts hanging side by side on a wooden wall. The combine harvester had no political opinions. It hated no one and loved no one. It was steel and iron and rubber and gasoline assembled according to principles that transcended nationality and war. It was built to cut wheat, and it cut wheat, and in doing so, it demonstrated something that all the speeches and force in the world could never demonstrate as clearly. That the true strength of a nation is measured not by its capacity to destroy, but by its capacity to feed, to build, to sustain, to improve the ordinary lives of ordinary people. That technology devoted to creation outlasts technology devoted to killing. That showing someone what life can be is infinitely more powerful than telling them what to think. And that sometimes the most effective answer to dangerous certainty is not a counter-argument, but a simple demonstration. A machine in a field, wheat going in, grain coming out. The quiet, overwhelming, unanswerable truth of a thing that works. The men who witnessed that demonstration returned to Japan and became part of its resurrection. They became fishermen and engineers and economists and teachers. They built systems of their own, designed for their own conditions, powered by a principle they had learned in Nebraska wheat fields. Build from truth. Build things that feed people, and the rest will follow. Whether their experience directly caused Japan's transformation is a question history cannot answer with certainty. But those who lived through it believed it mattered. They believed that seeing truth firsthand had planted seeds. Seeds of doubt about militarism. Seeds of confidence about peaceful development. And those seeds, like wheat seeds in Nebraska's soil, grew in ways no one could have predicted, reaching toward a future no one could have foreseen. And somewhere in a barn in western Nebraska, A rusting machine that once shattered a young officer's certainty still stands holding in its silent metal bones the most subversive lesson of the 20th century. That creation outlasts destruction, that feeding is stronger than killing, that the combine harvester, humble and ordinary and magnificent, is mightier than the sword. And that concludes our story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own family's history, if it made you think about the power of simply showing the truth, I would be honored to hear from you in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more untold stories from the war that shaped our world. Until next time.